Hey, welcome back. This is Shah. I'm glad you guys enjoyed my last video. Thank you for all the new subscribers. I have a video clip to share with you guys today from a woman who offers what she calls the counterpoint to Hoeflation. And she basically says that men have their own version of Hoeflation. We're going to watch a 3-minute clip. It goes on for a while, but she makes some important points and we're going to have to address them. So let's take a look at the clip.
I hear a lot of men talking about Hoeflation and how modern men have to put in 20 times more effort to bag a woman that has like a fraction of the value compared to like what his grandfather had to do in like the 1950s or earlier. But I don't hear anyone talking about the counter to this, where women today are literally settling for men who have testosterone levels the equivalent of what like a 60-year-old would have had in the 1950s. I don't hear anyone talking about how like the muscle mass of men has diminished so much that it's literally like shocking when you look back to footage of like 1950s, 60s, how shredded our country was and how jacked the guys were and like ripped, like how safe that must have felt for a woman being in the presence of these men. Like no one is talking about any of that. How many literal soy boys and like highly estrogenic men we have to sift through in the dating market. Men in like their princess era, men who like going 50-50 and don't find pride in taking care of a woman and like protecting and providing for her and his family. How that trait has literally been bred out of men in this country, in America. There was a very clear moment I remember a few months ago. I was on the beach and I was just looking around at all of the men on the beach. And all I saw were like very skinny men with no muscle mass, very soft, like effeminate looking men, soft features, softer jawlines, and overweight men. There was like not one man that I physically felt safe like being around, as in he could like defend me. And I don't think women really understand like the implications of this, and we don't understand it because we've really never had it in modern day. Like modern day has made men very weak and very lazy, and so that's literally the only context that we have. But when you study testosterone and you look back at images of men from like the 1940s, their physical like facial structures even look way different. Their faces are much wider, their jaw is much sharper, and that's just like a physical indication of what having high testosterone looks like in the male body. So what ends up happening anyways is, yeah, women settle for weak men because it's what's on the market. And frankly, most of them don't really know any better. Like there has been a lot of blame placed on women and things like the sexual revolution, things like the birth control pill for like heightened divorce rates, and rightly so. I talk about that on my channel, but I don't think we look at the opposite side of the street enough. I don't think we look at like what these implications really have on relationships and the female psyche and how safe we feel, how like turned on we feel with these partners. So yeah, men have to try a lot harder, but women also have to settle a lot more, in my opinion.
Okay, so she made a lot of points there. You know, some stuff I can pick at, but what I really want to focus on is the sort of feminization of men. And she said men that are kind of like way more estrogenic. I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to say right now, and then I'm going to run us through some studies and some articles that are going to back up what I'm going to say. She is right when she says men testosterone levels are down and the sperm counts are down and that men are less muscular, basically just overall less masculine than the men of the past. And she's pretty much saying that women have to settle for this because men aren't demonstrating true masculinity. The part of this that she's missing that's really important is that women have been affected by those exact same factors that are making men more feminine, and it's actually made them hyper-estrogenic. So that's a pretty big claim. There's been studies that show that phthalates, pretty much endocrine disrupting hormones that are a result of plastics in the environment, are disrupting men's fertility, and that's what's dropping the sperm count. What she did not mention is that those same things are causing women to have their first menstrual cycles earlier and earlier than they ever did. So I'm going to run you through a few books here and a few articles that discusses this, and that also points to endocrine disruptors being the cause of that. And ultimately, the conclusion I'm going to make once we pass all this stuff that I'm going to show you is that we live in a time where we have the most feminized men we've ever seen, but we also have the most hypersexual, promiscuous women we've ever seen And we have feminized men with not enough oomph in their system, and they're dealing with women who are hyper promiscuous. And you're putting these two together and you're trying to get them to, get married and make family units Matt Walsh style. So let's get through this. Humans could face reproductive crisis as sperm count declines, study finds. Global figures suggest sperm concentration has halved in 40 years and the rate of decline is accelerating. Okay, so this is from The Guardian. Total sperm counts fell by 62.3% during the same period. Research by the same team reported in 2017 found that sperm concentration had more than halved in the last 40 years. However, at the time, a lack of data for other parts of the world meant the findings were focused on a region encompassing Europe, North America, and Australia. The latest studies include more recent data from 53 countries. Declines in sperm concentration were not only seen in the region previously studied, but in Central and South America, Africa, and Asia. So we're seeing this all over the world. Now, what are the causes of this? While it is unclear what might be behind the apparent trend, one hypothesis is that endocrine disrupting chemicals or other environmental factors may play a role. Acting on the fetus in the womb, experts say factors such as smoking, drinking, obesity, and poor diet might also play a role, and that a healthy lifestyle may help to boost sperm counts. One thing we also see as a trend is that puberty in humans has been happening at an earlier and earlier age. Okay. Now, it's easier to see the onset of puberty in a woman because you just look at when their first menstrual cycle was and you're like, okay, they've reached puberty. For guys, it's a little tougher. I mean, you got to look at the other usual markers, but for women, you can pinpoint that. How do we know girls are entering puberty earlier? This is from Smithsonian Magazine. During the 1980s and 1990s, Marcia Herman Giddens noticed a phenomenon where a large number of girls coming into her clinic seemed to be developing earlier, some with breast development or pubic hair as young as age 5. Deerdorf says, in 1997, Herman Giddens published a study in the journal Pediatrics suggesting that girls were beginning puberty earlier. Her research concluded that during the 1860s, girls had their first period around age 16. The age had reached 14 by 1920. Herman Giddens found, and by 1997 had dropped to around 12 and a half. The study ignited a maelstrom of controversy, but other researchers have since added their own evidence, including a major 2010 pediatric study co-authored by Greenspan that revealed the early breast development rates cited above. Here's a New York Times article from 2022. Puberty starts earlier than it used to. No one knows why. Some girls are starting to develop breasts as early as age 6 or 7. Researchers are studying the role of obesity, chemicals, and stress. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that not only has the men's sperm counts and fertility been drastically affected by factors such as diet, obesity, the endocrine hormone disruptors, the phthalates that we see in plastic, and probably also sedentary lifestyle combined with that. We're still trying to pinpoint exactly what's what here. But on the girl side of things, they're starting puberty much, much earlier. So that's gone from age 16 since 1860, and that's gone all the way down through, 14, 12, and we're seeing girls as early as 6 to 7 starting to develop breasts, right? So we had a drastic change. Now, if we can see how early a woman starts puberty, wouldn't it be nice if we had a factor like that for men? What can we look for in men that demonstrates the same thing? Well, if you ever looked at the NoFap community, this is a community of people that are trying to kick porn addiction. They're trying to kick masturbation addiction. What you will find on there are a bunch of posts from guys that will tell their story. Like, I've started masturbating when I was 8 years old. That's when I first found porn. The part that's significant to me is that they're admitting that that's when they started masturbating, which to me is indicative of the start of puberty. Here's one. I am 17 years old and have been addicted to porn since I was 8. Today, I vow to never jerk off again. I've been masturbating since I was 5. I am not trying to be disgusting, but the truth is I have been masturbating since the age of 5. I got curious, and it led to a horrible addiction of this day. Especially these past few years, I masturbate at least 6 times a day. Wow. I've been on NoFap for 3 days now, but I am scared I'm going to relapse. Here's another one. Today, I found porn on my 8-year-old little brother's phone. Honestly, I don't even know what to say anymore. I feel like the times are getting worse and worse. How could a kid, an innocent 8-year-old kid, be watching pornography? Okay, so it's not looking good. We got both men and women, or excuse me, we have both boys and girls starting puberty much earlier than they ever did before. Now we have to look at what are possible causes. The first significant one are the endocrine disruptors. And we had Dr. Shah Swan, who appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast, that discussed the studies that I think she was the first to carry out, where she measured the gooch size. That's the distance between the tea bag and the brown poopy hole in guys. And the distance between those would indicate fertility in men. Okay. And she was also able to prove that the pregnant mother's exposure to the phthalates, to the endocrine disruptors from plastics, the greater the exposure, the higher the incidence of the short gooch sizes. Okay. And then she further ties that into the rise of the petrochemical industry, because the byproducts of the petrochemical industry are what led to the rise of plastics and all these endocrine disruptors being in our environment now.
The growth of these chemicals tracks with the growth of the petrochemical industry because they're made from petrochemical byproducts. Okay? So if you look at a curve of the growth, it starts around 1950. Okay? So back in 1950, you have people loving science, jumping on the science bandwagon. There's this better living through chemistry that everyone's talking about. And everybody is just wanting everything made of plastic. You know, it's the new craze. It's the new, and it just took off.
Okay, so 1950s onwards, we start seeing plastic enter the market. It's getting in everybody's homes. And then finally, we start having, we see 1970s onwards to now, we're seeing this huge drop in sperm count. All right. And then along also from mid-1900s, even earlier, we're seeing the earlier and earlier onset of puberty in children, particularly with women and earlier menstrual cycles. There's another thing that tracks alongside this that's not just the endocrine disruptors, and that's the rise of, refined sugar and basically just industrialized foods that don't have a lot of nutritional value. I'm going to show you a couple excerpts from a lot older books. One of them's Pure White and Deadly by John Yudkin. Okay, and another one is called Sugar Blues by William Duffy. As sugar production became cheaper, we started seeing more and more and more of it enter our society. And a lot more foods began to have sugar snuck into it, especially because, you can get foods on the shelf that would last longer, right? I mean, then you started seeing the studies coming out demonizing fat. And people started doing the low fat craze, but then they started getting more sugar in their diets. So this tracks along also with the endocrine disruptors. The earlier books I'm going to show you are focused more on sugar and obesity in our diet than endocrine disruptors. So here's Pure White and Deadly. So this book actually came out, I believe, in the early 1970s. All this points to the possible role of sugar in producing childhood obesity. But there is now evidence that sugar may also produce other effects in children. One of the very remarkable changes that has occurred in human physiology during the last century is the reduction in the age when boys and girls reach maturity. Because it is easier to detect maturity in girls than in boys by the date when menstruation begins, more information exists about girls, but studies do show earlier maturity also in boys. Briefly, each decade has seen a decrease of some 3 or 4 months in the age at which puberty begins. In the past 130 years, the age at which Norwegian girls have reached puberty has fallen by almost exactly 4 years, from an average of 17 years to an average of 13 years. The same trends can be seen in Sweden, England, and the United States. In 1905, the average age of puberty in American girls was 14 years and 3 months. Today, it is just about 12 years. Okay, so this book came out in the 70s. We're in 2023 now. So back then it had moved from 17 to 12. Now we're, looking at like 7, 8 and all this kind of stuff for breast development. So in that intervening 50 years when sugar really took off, plastic really took off, we're seeing that same trend in decrease alongside the trend in lower male fertility here, right? Smaller gooch sizes, according to Dr. Shah Swan, and less sperm count overall. Here's another book called Sugar Blues by William Duffy. I believe this one also came out in the 70s. I've been conducting a survey. Every young female sugar addict I know has confessed the same thing. They don't know now, and never have known what it was to have a normal menstrual period, without pain, cramps, or extreme discomfort. No wonder the TV commercials show mother introducing their teenage daughters to the wonders of pain-killing drugs for those very special days of feminine discomfort. I got turned onto the subject when I met a young actress. When the day came for her big scene, she started acting as temperamental as Marilyn Monroe. When I guessed what was ailing her, she let it all out. I showed her how to kick sugar. She was willing and ready to do anything to relieve the 3-day torture that had occurred monthly since she had reached puberty. Her next period was noticeably better, and within 2 months, she had completely forgotten her menstrual period was due, because she had been accustomed to having 24 hours of warning pain before the onset of menstruation. After this experience, I began to feel like Dr. Kildare. My beautiful patient spread the message through fitting rooms and dressing rooms from New York to California. Subsequently, I've discovered that many doctors, especially in France, have been wise for decades to the lethal effects of sugar on feminine metabolic balance. In the magazine La Vie Claire, Dr. Victor Lorenc wrote, "With women, sugar causes pains during menstruation. Here is the case of Sophie Z. She used to take a daily consumption of approximately 100 grams of industrial sugar. And by industrial sugar, the thing to note here is we're not talking about sugars and fruits. We're talking about refined sugar, white sugar, high fructose corn syrup, isolated sugar. At the age of 30, her menstruation became extremely painful. This discomfort disappeared completely with the suppression in 1911 of this murderous food. Since that time, we have been able to observe many analogous cases. This fact ought to be known and spread abroad by workers with women." So, I'll admit, this is old science, okay? The facts that we have here, that we do know, puberty is starting earlier in both men and women. Men are experiencing lesser fertility. We know that from the gooch sizes. We know that from semen samples, okay? And women, if this is to be believed, actually experience far more cramps and pain in their menstrual periods than they did before since the rise of sugar. Obesity. This part of the article tries to find factors that are contributing to the earlier onset of menstruation for women. One of the factors, obesity. As of 2012, a staggering 1 in 5 U.S. children or adolescents are obese, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Obesity is a huge factor. We know a huge contributing factor to obesity is things like refined sugar, white flour, refined carbohydrates. All right, so after obesity, the next one, exposure to hormone mimicking chemicals. Girls' exposure to an array of potential chemical influences can begin in the womb, so that by the time an 8 or 9-year-old girl begins to undergo puberty, it's difficult to determine which, if any, of the many unintended substances found in her body may have helped trigger the change. Some endocrine disrupting chemicals are undergoing specific tests for possible roles in early puberty. These chemicals are so structurally similar to estrogen that, when ingested, they cause estrogen-specific reactions throughout the body. What we're seeing is these petrochemical byproduct plastics are mimicking estrogen. When it hits the males, it's lowering the sperm count in men, and it's making men not as masculine. When it's hitting women, it's bumping them with estrogen way before their time, and it's making them hyper feminine, right? Now they're becoming hyper promiscuous, hyper sexualized. They got the irregular periods. And we got 2 separate sources here that are linking petrochemical byproducts, the phthalates, endocrine hormone disruptors, from Shauna Swan talking about the men, and from the Smithsonian magazine talking about how it affects women. And then we also got obesity from the other sources I showed. So what we can gather from this is that men and women have gone through drastic changes, okay? And in the video we watched earlier with the TikToker, she's pretty much saying men aren't as masculine, testosterone levels is down, men aren't as muscular, the jawlines aren't defined, and all these things. And all of that is true. We can see this from the corruption of our food supply, from the introduction of these petrochemical byproducts, plastics. And it has its effect on men. However, what she fails to realize is that there is an equal and opposite effect on women. We're living in this era where we have the most feminized men that's ever existed and the most masculinized, hypersexualized, painful, irregular period having moody women than ever before. And we got these two coming together, trying to figure things out, and it's just been a catastrophe. I think the important thing to take away from this is that it's a complete waste of time for men to blame women for these problems, and it's a complete waste of time for women to blame men for this problems. Instead, what we should be doing is blaming the folks that are in power, the elite people, big sugar, big whoever, big oil, big science, big everybody who's taking money in order to sell out the American people and everybody else for profits. Instead, we're just fighting each other. This whole thing about puberty is so interesting. It's like we always hear the metaphor when we talk about like late bloomer. You know what I mean? It's compared to a flower. And it's just like, it would be better if we engaged with puberty at an older age, because that means our young bodies would have had a much longer time to be in that cocoon phase before it finally flowers. And the problem is we're coming out of our cocoon phase at like age 8 when these young guys are looking at their cell phones, masturbating for the first time. And these ladies, are starting to menstruate for the first time. And it's not letting us stay in that cocoon phase for a long enough time, because if the men started going through puberty at 16, they would probably have higher fertility. It would be like the springboard is loaded more to give a man a higher sperm count. And also for women, their bodies would be much more adept at dealing with their menstrual cycles, so it's less painful, there's less cramps. However, what we have now is just a lot of chaotic disorder. And we're seeing those issues now and how it's affecting things like relationships, marriage, and all these kinds of things. So, going back to the TikToker in the beginning, in one sense, she's right about the men. Her issue is that she also needs to look at how this is affecting the women. And it's like a two-pronged problem. And it's really, really freaking sad. Anyways, if you like this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment down below, and we'll see you on the next one.